Don't worry, nothing's wrong with your screen. I just need to step back away from the camera. Okay, there we go. Hi, my name's Prophet of Zod. Vice Rhino asked me to fill in today because he's really busy, and apparently it's gotten so dire that he doesn't mind people of my quality appearing on his channel. So that's what I'm going to do. And since I want to do a really good job for him, I figured I'd swing for the fences and go after the biggest, bestest apologist of them all. Josh Fierstein. I mean, William Lane Craig. But then really, what is Craig except for a Fierstein who has a better vocabulary and doesn't dress like a douchey teenager? And I'm being a little serious. Once you get past the exterior polish of this well-dressed and articulate confidence man, you find he says practically nothing of any intelligent substance. I addressed this a few times in a series I called William Lane Craig, Idiot or Willful Piece of But since I'm not sure if Mr. Rhino wants me to keep saying words like on his channel, I'll forgo that format. Instead, let's dive straight into an example of Craig's elaborate way of not explaining anything. In this case, he's going to try to work his way around the Euthyphro Dilemma, a pretty unavoidable logical bind that shows why an objective morality could not come from God. I'll let Craig sum it up for you.
Well, that's a dilemma posed in one of Plato's dialogues to people who say that goodness, moral value, is based in the gods. Socrates asks Euthyphro, do the gods will something because it is good, or is something good because the gods will it? If you say that the gods will something because it's good, then the good is independent of the gods. It's not dependent on them at all. But if you say that the good is whatever the gods will, then that seems to be an example of might makes right. They could have declared something totally different to be the good, and so it makes good and evil arbitrary, which seems wrong.
That was a reasonable explanation, but I want to reiterate in language that makes it crystal clear what the options are and what it would take to get around them, just in case Craig might try using semantics to obscure the nature of the dilemma. Spoiler alert, he's totally going to. Boiled down to its bare essence, the problem here is that morality either has to come from inside God or from outside of him. If it comes from inside him, it's only his personal will or opinion, making it arbitrary instead of objective. If it comes from outside of him, then he's not the source of morality, and invoking him to make it objective is meaningless. So if Craig wants to justify grounding morality in God, he needs to either 1. Show that morality comes from somewhere other than inside or outside God, or 2. Explain why these consequences don't follow from the two options. If we keep in mind that this is what it boils down to, his attempts at obfuscation are going to look pretty silly. But let's give him his shot, huh?
And this dilemma is often pressed against those who believe that goodness and moral value is grounded by God.
This is just a quick detail, but listen to how Craig characterizes this problem.
And this dilemma is often pressed against those who believe that goodness and moral value is grounded by God.
Basically, he paints outsiders as aggressively pressing this argument, not only against the concept of divine objective morality, but against the people who believe it. He knows his audience already feels besieged and looks to him for answers, so he raises the stakes by making them feel personally targeted and thus more invested in any explanation he can throw at them. This is a small detail, but it's vital to understanding his interaction with his only audience, predisposed believers.
I think, however, that the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma because there's a third alternative.
So he's not arguing the consequences of the two options, but is instead making the spectacular claim that there's a third option, namely that morality could have originated somewhere other than inside or outside God. From here he says a lot really quickly, so I'm going to play the whole thing so you can get the full effect before we go back and unpack what he did.
It's not the case that God wills something because it is good, nor is it the case that something is good just because God wills it. Rather, God wills something because He is good. That is to say, it is God's own nature which determines what is the good. God is by nature essentially compassionate, just, fair, kind, loving, and so forth. And because He is good, His commandments to us reflect necessarily His nature. And therefore, the commandments of God and our moral duties are rooted in God's essence. They are not arbitrary. They are rooted in God Himself. but they aren't grounded in anything external to God. God is himself the good, who is the source of our moral duties.
All right, so let's go back and see what this was all about.
It's not the case that God wills something because it is good, nor is it the case that something is good just because God wills it. Rather, God wills something because he is good.
So when faced with the question, is it good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's good, Craig offers as a third option, God wills something because he is good. But this statement doesn't even address the same topic as the first two. And I don't even mean it's a bad third option. I'm saying that, as phrased, it's totally irrelevant to the question of where good comes from. If anything, his statement that God equals good just takes us back to square one, where we must still answer whether he's good because he defines that goodness or because he conforms to an outside standard. Of course, Craig's going to clarify soon, but he's definitely assisted by this added layer of linguistic confusion.
That is to say, it is God's own nature which determines what is the good.
And once Craig explains what he means, we find out that his third option is actually just a rephrasing of the first option. Morality comes from within God, but in slightly different words, and we'll get back to the semantics behind this soon. But I hope you're starting to see the strategy here. Basically, Craig's just constantly rephrasing a string of non-answers or bad answers so quickly and in so many different ways that people start to lose track of the fact that he's not getting anywhere.
God is by nature essentially compassionate, just, fair, kind, loving, and so forth. And because he is good, his commandments to us reflect necessarily his nature.
What Craig did here is pretty key. Look carefully at the attributes he assigns to God. He mentions compassion, justice, fairness, kindness, and love. Now, of course, God has many other complex attributes that I'd say are given at least as much weight in the Bible, including jealousy, tribalism, the expectation of worship, concern over how tabernacles get built, and a hankering for the smell of burning animals. But Craig knows that these seem either morally problematic or morally irrelevant, so he handpicks character traits that we appreciate and that help humans get along, then launders them through God and claims God generated them. But what's the point of this? Why can't we just go straight from noticing these traits have practical value to practicing them? Why take this diversion through God first? And why attribute them to God when there are perfectly clear secular reasons for choosing them? The only use I can see for this practice is as an apologetic tool. Basically, saying morality comes from God is only palatable, or even coherent, after you've defined God using traits that are good for reasons external to him. In other words, Craig's meandering, incoherent answer is plagued by the logical problems found on both sides of the dilemma.
And therefore, the commandments of God and our moral duties are rooted in God's essence. They are not arbitrary. They are rooted in God himself, but they aren't grounded in anything external to God. God is himself the good, who is the source of our moral duties.
So now, finally, we get to the substance of Craig's answer, which is that good is determined not by God's will, nor by anything outside God, but by his nature or his essence. Now I know what you're probably thinking because you're not f***ing idiots. Is God's nature really any different from his will? Well, technically it is different in some ways, but not in any relevant to this discussion, and shifting the problem from God's will back to his nature does absolutely nothing. Because if your will is a determination you make about how something should be, then your nature is nothing other than a collection of traits that drive your will. So really, all Craig is doing is using a slightly different vocabulary to express the same idea. Which is why I wanted us to remember that morality had to come from either inside God or outside God. To illustrate, imagine I have a bunch of friends over for a dinner party, and when they arrive, I demand that everybody sit in pre-assigned seats and eat in total silence. Now naturally, they're going to ask why the f*** I'd expect them to do such a thing, right? So what explanation could I give them? Could I just tell them that it's my will that they do so? No, because as explained in the Euthyphro Dilemma, my will is arbitrary and based on my whims. Okay, but then what if I, like Craig, got the really brilliant idea to tell them that my nature was such that I enjoyed silence? Would that make any progress whatsoever toward demonstrating that my command was objectively right? Of course not. all I would be doing would be explaining my arbitrary reasons for my arbitrary command. Absolutely no philosophical advance was made by shifting from the use of the word will to the use of the word nature. One thing, and one thing alone, would demonstrate that my command had any moral relevance, and that would be an explanation of how it impacted people for the better. If I said, "Be quiet because the walls here are paper thin and my neighbors have a sleeping baby," that would be reasonable. If I established a similar rule at a school where kids needed to eat quickly and avoid distractions, that would make sense. But the point is that some such rational explanation would be needed before any command I issued would be considered at all moral. This is the case for any human authority, and it would be the case with any proposed God figure. This is why, even if God existed, the second prong of the Euthyphro Dilemma would apply, and as far as God's commands were good, it would be because they were wise and beneficial for reasons external to him, or her. And even Craig knows this is the case, which is why he had to load his portrayal of God's nature with attributes we understand to be good before saying God was good. The fact is that stating something is moral just because a being wills it is nonsense, and Craig's attempt at slapping a band-aid over this problem by distinguishing between God's will and his nature is even more transparent nonsense. Basically, Craig explained nothing while serving up rapid-fire reiterations of nonsense and hoping he could cloud the field with linguistic ambiguity, which is pretty much what he does. So the Euthyphro Dilemma remains unanswered, in spite of an attempt by the most revered Christian apologist. And it will remain unanswered because it's unanswerable. Because the idea of objective morality being generated by God is nonsense. Anyway, I hope this was helpful or at least interesting. I appreciate Vice Rhino letting me present on his channel, and I appreciate you sticking around to watch. If you like what you saw, you can go subscribe to my channel. And if you didn't, then I guess that would be a waste of time, so don't. Have a good day.
Thank you so much to Prophet of Zod for filling in for me today. If you enjoyed his video, he's got some great content on his channel. I particularly enjoyed his examination of early New Testament manuscripts and the claim that the Bible must be true because of how many manuscripts there are. Go check that out and subscribe to his channel for more. See you next time.